morning. Today's gospel lesson is one that is familiar to all of us from the time that we were very, very young. It is the story of Zacchaios. At first glance, we recall Zacchaios being a short man, wanting to see Christ, who was walking to come into a city. He couldn't see him because there was a large crowd, so he climbs up in a tree. Christ sees him, tells him to come down from the tree, that he's going to eat at his house at that very day. And Zacchaios then, having a change of heart, tells him that he is going to give money to the poor and repay those whom he has cheated fourfold. But there is so much more to this parable than is conceivable just from a first glance. And so in order for us to be able to peel back the layers, to understand the lesson that Christ is teaching us through the saying of this parable, we must look first and foremost to see what it is that was happening and where and to what city Christ was walking to. So we are told that Christ was entering the city of Jericho. That's where he comes upon Zacchaios. Now, we've heard of Jericho before. It's a city, it was a rather large city that didn't have the greatest of reputations. In fact, it was on the road to Jericho that the man was attacked by 3 robbers and left for half dead, and then given assistance by the Good Samaritan. And so now we see that Christ is entering this city of Jericho that has all of the trappings of big city life. They existed then, they still exist today. And Christ now, coming into the city, comes across Zacchaios. Now, let's take a deeper look at Zacchaios. Zacchaios, we are told, was a tax collector. And not just a tax collector, chief tax collector. Which tells us certain things. First, it tells us that he was probably very rich. And he probably wasn't made rich because he lived a very fair and honest life. Every time I hear this story, I hearken back to my early Saturday morning days of watching cartoons and seeing the Bugs Bunny one where he goes, 1 for you, 1, 2 for me, 1, 2 for you, 1, 2, 3, 4 for me. Because that's how taxes were collected back then. Sure, there was an amount that needed to be given to the state, amount required by Caesar, taxes. We have them today. But the tax collectors at the time took more than what was allotted. And they did not pass on the more that they took to the state. They simply pocketed the rest and became wealthy by these really terrible ways. So now we start to get a better understanding of who Zacchaios was. Now, chief tax collector. So not just any tax collector, but one who was probably overseeing many tax collectors. And as the chief amongst them was probably also getting some type of kickback from all the other tax collectors that were under his supervision. Imagine now the treachery. These things did not go unseen by the people of the city. That's why people hated tax collectors. These things were seen, and these thefts were well known. And when one was rich, it was certainly flaunted in society, both now and back then. So this is who Zacchaios is. Now we are told that he sought to see Jesus, but could not on account that he was small of stature, that he was short. Now, some of the fathers of the church look at his height, and don't take it to mean literal shortness, but take it to mean that he was of the world. He was engrossed in the things of this life, in his love of money, in a heart full of treachery. And so, by being close to the cares of the earth, he was short of stature for the story. That's their interpretation. We know this, that he could not see because of his height, and he sought to see Jesus. And on account of that fact, he goes and he climbs up into a tree. Other church fathers have looked at this action to say, look what he's doing to see Christ. By climbing up into the tree, he is separating himself from the world, is he not? He's no longer standing on the solid footing of the ground, but rather he is separating himself from the world to gain a better vantage point to be able to see Christ. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up to him and said, Zacchaios, make haste and come down, for I must stay at your house today. Zacchaios climbs up the tree in order to be able to see Christ, in order truly to be able to know him. That action already begins this transformation of heart that we see in its fullness at the end of this parable. Christ, recognizing this act, comes to him. That's a powerful part of this entire parable. Because in the person of Zacchaios, we can place all of us. And as Zacchaios seeks to separate himself from the cares of the world, to seek out Jesus, to see him, we are called to do the same. To place our eyes on the Lord, and to separate ourselves from the temptations that seek to keep us tethered to the things of this world that are subject to rust and corruption and decay. And to keep our eyes and thoughts on that which is heavenly, that which leads to our salvation. And when we do that, when we make those actions, Christ will seek us out. Now notice, Zacchaios wasn't holy, but within his heart he had a desire to see Christ. Christ is who brings holiness to Zacchaios, not the other way around. But Zacchaios had a realization, came to himself, saw perhaps that this life of treachery was going nowhere, and he sought to see Christ. And Christ, seeing not just him on the tree, but understanding this change that was coming within Zacchaios, comes to him and says, "Come down, today I will have supper with you in your house." And those around him, as the gospel account reminds us, began to murmur. They began to gossip. They began to look at each other and say, "He's going into the house of a sinner. What business does he have there?" We get to that towards the end, as Christ reminds us that he has not come to the world to save those who are righteous, but has come rather to call the lost, to seek those who have gone astray and to bring them back to him, to bring them home, to bring them to heaven. Now, what does Zacchaeus do after he has supper with the Lord? What does he say to him? He says, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." There are two separate actions there. A, Zacchaeus' desire and his pledge to give half of what he has to the poor. And the second is to restore anything that he has defrauded anyone of fourfold, 4 times the amount. Now, why are both of these things separate, yet similar and together? Let's look first at the restoration of what he had stolen, right? All of the things that he had taken illegally from others. The restoring of that shows that he is trying to live according to the law, according to what the law that was given to the Jews, as found in Exodus. That one should not, that because he has cheated someone of something, he should restore it times 4 to make that action whole and pure once again. Now, the giving to the poor. That is to show his love for the gospel. That he takes half of what he has and gives to those who are in need and are in want. That's what we are called to do, right? In this morning's gospel lesson, we hear the same gospel that is proclaimed at each and every baptism, to go into the world to baptize the nations, to teach them about God, and to bring that message of his resurrection to all. Each Sunday, each celebration of the Divine Liturgy, we gather and we partake of the Lord's Supper when we receive the Holy Eucharist. And having done so, we separate ourselves from the cares of this world and elevate our perspective to be able to see God in our midst. Much like Zacchaeus, we leave this experience changed. We are not the same. Not because of anything that we did to distinguish ourselves, but rather because Christ himself has sought us out, has called us to him, and has made us whole through his grace. For as the concluding verse of this very powerful pericope states, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."